To get started, I thought I'd share a little story. In summer 2016, I visited Cairo to gather research for my doctoral dissertation. This story takes place on the last week of Ramadan. It was early afternoon, under a scorching sun, and I was walking to the Coptic Orthodox Patriarch in OCSA. I had been warned not to publicly consume food or drink, so I naturally became dehydrated and, without thinking, pulled out a bottle of water. At that moment, I felt something whiz by my head. A rock hit a parked car to my right. I shoved the bottle back in my bag and I hurried through the gates, past metal detectors and armed guards. Just inside, I made my way to wait in a lobby for a meeting with a local bishop. Seated next to me was an upper Egyptian man from Resolute. His village suffered many casualties as a result of the murder of migrant Copts in Libya by ISIS in 2015. Sectarian violence then broke out in the village. This led to mediation imposed by the government and the signing of vows to abstain from violence under threat of corporal punishment. Tensions were high and fears of blasphemy charges led some Christians involved in retaliations to flee. He was one of them, and he recalled, "We were the majority in the village, he said, but we're surrounded by this village and that village, all Muslim. It's easy for them, the government never stands up for a Christian." Never allowed to return for fear of reprisals, he would sit for hours every month and wait to hear words of comfort from the bishop. So, still waiting, I went to the patriarchal canteen to buy a sandwich and drink, which came to £500. I saw a young couple, perhaps in their early 20s, sharing a meal. For poor young Copts, the walls of the patriarchate provided safety and security from the outside world, and a manageable expense for a day. That night, I went to a popular lounge on the Nile, visible signs of piety, the prayer bump on the forehead, the veil, the long beard. Then, except of course for the wealthy Gulf Arabs and their families taking up large, expensive tables near to watch. Otherwise, Egyptians, whether Muslim or Christian, were indistinguishable. When the bill arrived, it amounted to £350 per person. The average Egyptian salary is around £3,500 a month. In one day, in a Cairo inn, I experienced stark differences that configure everyday life. Nowhere in the world is frequently equality, and nowhere are the working class and the underprivileged not the victims of the greatest injustice. This talk is titled Beyond Persecution, precisely because I want to talk about the effects of interlocking systems of power that affect interlocking systems of power on Copts in Egypt's modern history. First, let me explain my usage of such terms as persecution, discrimination, sectarianism. The Oxford Dictionary defines persecution as you have heard, hostility and ill treatment, especially because of race or political or religious beliefs, and that such oppression remains persistent. Yet the meaning of persecution is neither self-evident nor defined satisfactorily in such documents as the UN Human Rights Code or Canada's Immigration and Refugee Protection Act. In fact, self-interest has motivated states responding to refugee flows since the 1920s that adhere to a politics of denunciation that continues to limit and confuse the search for a definition and block claims by those deemed as economic migrants. Within such ambiguity, we find certain commonalities. To be considered persecution, the mistreatment suffered or anticipated must be serious to such an extent that subsistence, expression, or exercise of that interest might be compromised. As such, the serious denial of dignity and the sustained or systemic denial of core human rights is persecution, abetted by a demonstrated failure of state protection. To that end, human rights must not be left to the subjective perspective of one country. The experience of the man from Resolute, I believe, speaks to that. Violence, death, or disfigurement elevate discrimination or harassment to persecution that is serious, repeated, or persistent. When speaking of the Copts in Egypt, I contrast the democratic promise of the early 20th century with the rise of discrimination and harassment, leading eventually to persistent persecution of numerical, linguistic, racial, and or religious minorities by a dominant majority that is institutionalized by the state. Yet sectarianism is not a primordial feature of Middle East states. Too often, Egypt's Copts are presented simply as the quintessential victims and symbols of Christian oppression under Muslim rule. This narrow vision, common in international press and most academic studies, reminds us of perceiving tensions that may be on and help to configure sectarian identity, that is, strong allegiance to one religious or political grouping. Indeed, sectarianism in the Middle East was part of the 19th century process of creating national identity, and Copts are not simply a very simple reified and artificial binary of the violent Islamic East and the benevolent Christian West. Last November, Islam has done an open fire on a bus leaving the St. Samuel Coptic Orthodox Monastery in Upper Egypt's Namibia government, killing at least 7 and injuring 16 others. The attack is similar to another one that took place in May 2017. One gunman opened fire on buses transporting Copts to the same monastery, killing 28 people. Following such attacks, the state frames the perpetrators as foreign elements that threaten national unity. The Egyptian press fall into victim-blaming rhetoric by claiming they knew better than to be on a dark road at night. North American media is also guilty of such victim-blaming, largely situating the violence within a context of Christians pursuing wholesale support for President El-Sisi's regime. Such narratives not only attempt to posit the attack as an isolated or exceptional incident, but also reduce Copts to homogeneous supporters of a regime that provides them with special protection, yet perpetuates their continued exclusion and persecution. Both the violence and the rhetoric engenders have a history. Nationalist, Islamist, and church reform movements in the 19th century helped to lay the groundwork for an emergent national identity that increasingly drew distinctions between Christians and Muslims. Western intervention in the form of British occupation and later United States imperialism further entrenched such movements and engendered a more nationalistic, ethnic-based character. Categories of minority and majority emerged from these attempts to define the modern nation and delimit its boundaries. By the 20th century, the state and its attendant institutions brought religious life under new forms of regulation and ultimately exasperated religious difference. Sectarian identity thus became sutured to religion by the state so that religious prejudices could not be easily separated. So for a comparison, one could think of systemic racism in North American society to understand how such a position naturalized the institutionalized discrimination by Egypt's Muslim majority toward its Christian minority. As for minorities here, such virulent discrimination had the added consequence of producing a reduced identity among Egypt's Christian population. A reduced identity means that you must denounce what sets you apart in order to be accepted and acknowledged. Yet, even if you are accepted, you must manage your emotions, your actions, and people's expectations. It becomes your responsibility to be a spokesperson for an entire group. Such a reduced identity developed over time. After the 1919 revolution, and though it was made of divergent group interests, the middle-class left or delegation party and their supporters created to the press an imagined community of the Egyptian nation, and saw themselves in fraternal terms as representing all Egyptians. They in fact represented the liberal ideals of secular middle-class reformers. In 1922, the British granted Egypt conditional independence and a constitution, but maintained control over foreign policy, the Suez Canal, Sudan, and most of the economy. The West was administratively controlled by both Muslims and Christians. Following their victory in the 1922 election, debates arose over proportional representation and the inclusion of minority languages in the Constitution. The question, how to eliminate religious inequality without making religious difference part of the political vocabulary. Participants in the debate were far more divided by class and political ideals than by their religious affiliations. Tied to international debates affecting the formation of nation-states globally, secular and nationalists adhered to the model of the West and a rallying cry. Egypt belongs to Copts as well as Muslims. All have a right to the same freedom and the same privileges, they said. Minority language was unnecessary, declared some Coptic nationalists like William Wiese. Copts are not a minority because they belong to no other nation than Egypt, he said. Nor do they want a government that represents anyone but the Egyptian people, nor do they claim a language other than Arabic. The West then successfully killed minority representation in the 1923 Constitution, and were vindicated when Copts won more seats than their share of the population in 1924 and then again in 1928. Debates continued throughout the interwar period. Some Muslims and Copts feared that Article 149 which declared Islam as the religion of the state, secured a formal and enduring place for Islam and created an unfair system. Secularists disagreed and argued that political secularism would eventually win out and religion would just fade away, as was the case in Muslim countries. Ironically, faith in a future pregnant with secular possibility inscribed religious difference in the language of the state, and minority representation remains to this day a point of debate. Egypt has a large Sunni majority and a numerically significant Coptic minority. Up to the 1960s, it also hosted diverse groups of Armenians, Greeks, Italians, Jews, Syro-Lebanese, and others who were granted special protections and in some cases favored by British policy. This helped to feed resentment by the native Egyptian, both Muslim and Christian, towards such foreigners. Since then, the designation minority presents a threat to the integrity of the nation's sovereignty and unity, that is, the and the Coptic Orthodox Church continues to conceive of religious liberty as a collective right. Minority is a term to be derived, where community is a viable political unit exercising authority through the church. The trappings of democratic life also mask deep underlying social divisions. For instance, parliaments were unrepresentative and the franchise was limited. Political organizations and trade unions restricted associational life at the whim of imperial authorities. And newspapers were always subject to heavy censorship. Nationalist movements reflected the interests of the elites who dominated. Then, rural to urban migration produced rising university enrollments and the proliferation of industry, which meant a greater number of people available for mass mobilization. This led to agitation in the 1930s that witnessed an initial shift in focus from Western democracy to a revival of the East and attraction to totalitarian forms of governance exemplified by fascism and Nazism. A young nationalist generation, disgruntled with the old guard, questioned established politics. The continued search for an authentic alternative led Egypt's anti-colonial movement to fracture along confessional lines. On one side were Muhammad and the Muslim Brotherhood, whose motto was, "The Quran is our constitution, Arabic our language, and death in the way of God, our greatest hope." On the other side was the Society of the Coptic nation, whose motto was, "God is our king, Egypt our country, the gospel our law, and the cross our badge, and death for the sake of Christ our greatest hope." These movements did not necessarily reject liberal governance, but rather continued debates over the question of religion and society. However, the influence of confessional politics on the Muslim majority and the evolving language of state protection marginalized Christians further within the country. In 1931, only the medical testimony of Muslim doctors was legally accepted. By 1934, new regulations for church building, called the 10 Conditions, required, among other stipulations, royal approval and support by local Muslim inhabitants. That same year, Sharia laws were implemented in the drafting of wills. Copts became increasingly excluded from politics, with 7.1% of political representation in the 1930s, and only 3% in the last West Parliament of 1950. As a reduced identity took root, the church served as a refuge and a place for social networking. Copts became increasingly marginalized in government, in private enterprise, and university teaching positions under an implicit 10% rule that limited their hiring. There developed an inherent shaming of Coptic Christians in Egyptian discourse. You are allowed to be Coptic and you are allowed to be successful, but can't really be both. Otherwise, you risk raising the ire of bigoted factions in the Muslim majority. Discriminatory hiring practices were compounded by mob attacks on Coptic places of worship that by the 1950s took on a more organized form. Disillusionment and widespread frustration led some Copts to channel their efforts through philanthropic organizations and Coptic magazines. Relations between the church and the lay council, already bad, deteriorated as infighting intensified over control of religious endowments after the tendency of Pope Isaac II in 1946. Forced to abdicate in 1956, Bishop Dionysius became acting patriarch, and in May 1959, Pope Kirill was the sixth was consecrated. Ibn Abd al-Nasr had come to power after the Free Officers' Revolution of July 1952, which brought an end to British privilege. He began a series of Egyptianization projects, later called nationalization projects, most famously the seizure of the Suez Canal. The 1956 Suez Crisis that followed then set Egypt as the geopolitical leader in the region, and Nasser's power and popularity allowed him to finance rapid economic and social development, dismantle parliament, the courts, and royal assets. Nasser's ascent had the effect of closing all alternative avenues for Coptic political participation. Civil society organizations atrophied and political parties collapsed or were culled under state control. The government was now composed of army officers, and Coptic representation declined because of minimal representation of Copts in the army. Those Copts Nasser appointed to administrative posts were technocrats with no real authority and lacking legitimacy afforded by the church. Nasser's Egyptianization targeted rural landowners and urban elites who were predominantly Coptic. Opting for one voice with which to resolve Coptic claims, Nasser empowered the Pope by confiscating religious endowments and abolishing religious courts, shifting all power to church control. With the entente between Nasser and Carolus, the lay council was effectively crushed. The Pope now held supreme authority over both the spiritual and material affairs of the Copts, whose position in Egyptian society diminished markedly. After years of exclusion by the Nasser regime, continued discrimination under Anwar Sadat made segregation more prevalent. One's name, as much as the cross that's on the wrist, became a badge and a marker of difference. Sadat sought to establish his own legacy and promoted the Islamic character of Egypt, which accelerated the professionalization of politics. After the death of Pope Carolus in 1971, Pope Shenouda began a series of mass ordinations of priests and bishops raised under his tutelage and worked to cement political control over the Copts. In 1973, the October War was used by Arab states as an excuse to hike oil prices. This show of power frightened policymakers and led the Americans, the World Bank, and the International Monetary Fund to force Egypt to cut both the quality and quantity of subsidies on basic commodities and educational guarantees. Encouraging private enterprise and foreign investment, Sadat's open door policy, what I call a piecemeal liberalization, only increased the gap between rich and poor and opened the door for the expansion of Islamist movements that had continued to provide aid on a grassroots level. Sadat would respond to any challenge to his authority with repression. As the state withdrew, both Muslim and Christian alternative networks spread to provide for the poor. An increasingly centralized Coptic church and Islamic organizations like the Muslim Brotherhood became the only viable political and social representative. Nasser's authoritarianism had cemented unparalleled church power, which led to greater isolation under Sadat. A critical sectarian incident occurred in November 1972, when a church, 2 shops, and 6 Christian houses were attacked in Kenya, 12 miles northeast of Cairo. The attack led Pope Shenouda to order priests and bishops to march through the streets and say Mass. This action was taken as provocation by local Muslim inhabitants, who resorted to further violence. Events in Kenya were informed by the 1972 implementation of Sharia law and civil codes. Legal debates and escalating violence then marked the 1970s. In March 1980, Pope Shenouda delivered a speech in which he angrily denounced proposals that Sharia law should be the basis for legislation. Sadat responded in May in a speech to Parliament where he accused Shenouda of political pretension. Fears began to mount with the proliferation of Islamists, now legitimized by the state. In his speech, Sadat declared, "I am the Muslim president of a Muslim country." Altercations between the president and the Pope came to a climax in June 1981. In 3 days, 17 died and 54 were injured in clashes between Copts and Muslims in Al-Zawiya al-Hamra district in Cairo, as a result of Muslim fatwas against Christian illegal church building. With limited intervention from the government, the Pope responded by declaring a mourning period and leaving for seclusion in St. Bishoy Monastery in Wadi Natrum. On September 3rd, secret police conducted mass arrests of over 3,000 state, religious, and public figures. 2 days later, the government positioned troops outside the monastery, and Sadat suspended the Pope, giving power over to a committee of bishops. The following month, Sadat was assassinated by the Muslim Brotherhood. Released in January 1985, the Pope opted for a new entente with President Hosni Mubarak, aligning himself with the state against the escalating Islamist threat, in return for concessions such as church permits and security. The Pope could thus turn his energies to regulate and standardize worship, broadcast his views on Christian television and radio programs, and establish committees on church matters. Despite this new entente, continued neglect for the poor and disadvantaged led many to flock to extremist organizations. In the 1990s, witnessed a spike in sectarian violence in the upper region. Churches were burnt, villagers attacked, and Copts died. With such massacres as the one in El-Kush in January 2000, which left 21 Copts dead, escalating attacks served as a ready excuse for further militarization of the security state. The Pope became an icon and savior, while violence against Copts were often met by local state inaction, under the veneer of protecting national security from exterior threats. Authoritarianism and nepotism under Hosni Mubarak informed the 2011 revolution. Further sectarian incidents, such as the massacre of Coptic parishioners in Nega Hammadi in 2010, jeopardized the power of the Coptic religious leadership, who appeared weak for failing to respond to anti-Coptic violence. Government-backed reconciliations either failed to do justice or, even worse, applied various forms of collective punishment. Property seizure, heavy financial settlement, exile, and forced relocation became the reality of Coptic victims. Remember that man from Samalu? Youth and middle-class activists took to Tahrir on January 25, 2011. Yet the promise of Tahrir was replaced by the doubling of sectarian incidents, and in the streets and on the airwaves, anti-Christian rhetoric became more widely tolerated. Such developments have only exaggerated historical divides, leading to almost constant attacks by Egypt's Islamic State affiliate and other homegrown militant movements since the 2013 revolution. The confessionalization of Egyptian politics has enshrined religion in public life. Religious institutions have since come to occupy the key position in political discourse. Today, the triumvirate of Egyptian governance of the President, the Al-Azhar, and the Coptic Pope, who routinely seen together, they appeared on TV to legitimize the overthrow of disgraced Muslim Brotherhood President Mohammed Morsi. Now more than 100 million people are faced with a weak economy, poor job prospects, military domination of local trade and industry, and crumbling medical and educational systems. Copts marginalized in the professions and without independent voices in governance are easy targets of discrimination and violence. Egypt does not need a benevolent dictator carrying the language of special protection, but rather a government willing to support and elevate those who are destitute, who have the least access to resources, and therefore are most likely to support fundamentalist sentiments, education, social welfare, community outreach, and a renewed emphasis on infrastructure, are vital to developing a language of inclusion and reversing a state of society where inequality ferments sectarian violence that is abetted by state inaction. Copts remain an integral part of Egyptian history and society. Though their position has diminished, much like African Americans and Indigenous peoples in Canada, they deserve equal recognition and participation in public life. Recent attacks on a synagogue in the US and mosques in New Zealand serve as reminders that bigotry and hatred spread in the absence of mutual understanding and respect.